This woman is a retired archaeologist. She's quite eccentric and has an almost obsessive passion for solving crimes. She has to drink a glass of wine every night at 6 p.m. Then she takes off all her clothes and dives into the nearby river to swim for half an hour. But today, as soon as Judith reached the middle of the river, she heard a gunshot from the opposite bank. With her sensitivity, she immediately realized that something bad must have happened to Stefan. She swam to the opposite bank to try to save him, but she couldn't find any place to climb up, so she hurriedly swam back home. The first thing she did was call the police. However, the next day, before she could even wake up, she received a phone call from the police. It turned out that the detectives had come to the scene but had not seen anyone and had not found anything unusual around the house. But what Judith noticed was that the detectives who arrived at the scene did not thoroughly check the entire area. She was adamant that someone had murdered Stefan, but the police chief thought that such a thing could not happen in a safe town like Marlow. Then, Judith immediately became interested. She quickly searched the cupboard for her tool bag and then rowed to the opposite bank. This time, she quickly found the landing site. Then she searched the garden for a while and finally found a shell casing on the grass. She guessed that it was clearly evidence left by the murderer after the crime. There was a blood stain next to the bench, but Stefan's body was gone. Obviously, the small river nearby became the best place to dump the body. So she went to the branch full of duckweed and broke off a branch. Then she used her hand to push the water hyacinth out of the water. Turned out that Stefan had died in the river. She was startled, but she did not panic. She immediately called the police. Before the police arrived, Judith spread out her specialized archaeological tool bag, then carefully picked up the shell casing and marked it with a ruler. Then she used her phone to take a picture of the evidence, then quickly put the evidence back in its original place and put the tool bag away. It was not long before the police discovered that the murderer had shot the victim in the forehead. It was as if the murderer was carrying out an execution. Since murders were extremely rare in this small town, this great responsibility fell on the overbearing police chief named Tanika. When Tanika questioned Judith, she excitedly presented her deduction that the victim had been shot next to the garden bench. Then the body fell into the river and drifted overnight to the creek. Judith was clearly very interested in this case. Hearing this, Tanika immediately reminded Judith not to interfere with the police investigation. Although Judith agreed very quickly, her heart was already blooming with excitement. As soon as Judith got home, she excitedly studied the photos. Looking closely, she saw that the bullet had a Nazi symbol from World War II. When the police left, Judith immediately went to Stefan's art gallery. She got a useful clue from the description of the store employee. It turned out that Stefan was only interested in calligraphy but had never collected guns from World War II. He was a gentle man who had never made enemies with anyone. There was only one time he had a dispute with a drunk man during a yacht race in town. Everyone there was very happy, but the auctioneer seemed to be too drunk, so he kept shouting at Stefan for no reason, calling him a swindler. Judith was excited and smiled when she heard that. Then she immediately went to visit the auctioneer. She said that on the day of the yacht race, he got drunk and got his clothes dirty while scolding Stefan. Now, she hoped to receive compensation for the dry cleaning. However, as soon as Judith mentioned Stefan, he immediately insisted that Stefan was a swindler because Stefan had cheated his customers of hundreds of thousands of pounds. Then he also guessed Judith's intention. He immediately scolded Judith for being a busybody. She thought of herself as an amateur detective. When Judith heard that, she stopped pretending and asked him where he was at 6 o'clock last night. However, the answer she received was beyond her expectations. He said that he was practicing singing at church and that there were 30 people who could testify. After he finished speaking, he angrily chased Judith out. Then, to verify his alibi, she went to the church again. But when she searched for the choir member list, she discovered that the pastor's wife, Bex, was hiding in the closet watching a movie. Judith immediately made her intentions clear. She said that she suspected the auctioneer had murdered Stefan in the gallery, but Bex said that she was also in the choir, and the suspect had been practicing at church all night. At this time, Judith suddenly had the idea that the murderer might have an accomplice. However, Bex thought that these things had nothing to do with her. Unexpectedly, a series of shocking actions by Judith later changed the entire course of the case. She cleverly quoted a passage from the Bible and finally moved Bex, who had always been indifferent to everything. Then Bex took the opportunity when the pastor was about to read Stefan's eulogy. She asked the chairman of the parish council and accidentally dug up a shocking secret that no one knew. At this time, the police seemed to be progressing quite slowly. The only thing they could find out was that the murder weapon belonged to the Second World War. The time was 6 p.m. and Judith was swimming in the Thames. Suddenly, she discovered that two neighbors often picked up some valuable items in the river. From then on, Judith seemed to immediately think of something. However, something strange happened that night. Just as she was concentrating on arranging the clues, the sound of broken glass suddenly startled her. Someone had thrown a brick into her house. On that brick was tied a piece of paper with 3 words, "Do not interfere." So she hurriedly called Tonica. Just as she was telling all her findings and speculations, she heard that another murder had just happened. The victim was a taxi driver who was also shot in the forehead and died right in his bed. But the strange thing was that in the victim's mouth, a necklace with the word hope was found. The person who reported the case was Susie. She went to deliver the dog and discovered the victim had been shot. However, at this time, Susie was still in a panic, so she couldn't think of any useful clues. At this time, Judith pretended to pass by, and she kindly took Susie home. Judith suspected that the 2 cases must be related, so she begged Susie to contact Judith if she remembered anything. When Judith got home, she immediately made a wall of clues about this murder. At this time, 2 women who were also passionate about the case came to find them. One was Judith, a retired archaeologist who never rested. One was Bex, the pastor's wife. The other was Susie, a single dog walker without a daughter. The Marlow Murder Club, founded by these 3 women, had been secretly formed. First, Susie remembered something. Few months ago, the murdered driver seemed to have made a big deal. But a few weeks later, when Judith asked about it again, the man avoided her, as if he had been tricked. Then, Bex heard some news from the chairman of the faculty council. It turned out that Stefan had actually been a scammer before. Stefan had cooperated with the auctioneer's father. If they discovered a valuable painting and the owner was not a knowledgeable person, the 2 of them would find a way to trick that person into thinking that the painting was just a waste. Stefan would then buy famous people's calligraphy paintings at low prices and resell them in London for a huge profit. The 2 would eventually split the money. But sometimes, if they came across a famous artist's legacy, Stefan would keep it for his collection. Although the 2 of them were working together, the idea of finding the prey was the auctioneer's father's. Now that he had passed away, it was possible that the auctioneer who had succeeded his father was the murderer. Although he had an alibi, at least he could not completely escape being involved in the case. And who was the person who threw the brick to warn Judith? At this time, Susie suddenly had an idea that if they could get the auctioneer's handwriting to compare, then they would have the answer. So the next second, Susie and Bex arrived at the auction house, but unexpectedly, the police had also investigated here. At this time, he suddenly remembered that a year ago, he had sold an antique gun. While he was taking out the book, Susie deliberately made a loud noise, causing everyone to rush to see. Bex took this opportunity to take a photo of the book. After that, Judith compared it and discovered that the handwriting did not match the writing on the warning paper. Luckily, Bex was able to take a photo of the buyer's name. She realized that this person was also a member of the choir, so the 3 of them immediately went to visit. Then, their eyes were opened because this person's house was filled with World War II collectibles. However, when they mentioned the gun, they discovered that the holster was empty. The gun's owner also looked confused, as if it had been stolen. At this moment, a fully armed Special Forces force suddenly broke in. It turned out that the police had also investigated here, but when Tonica saw Judith's group, she was very surprised. She immediately warned them that if they continued to interfere, they would be arrested for obstruction of public service. Then Bex accidentally discovered a woman with a panicked face at Stefan's funeral. At that moment, Judith also discovered familiar handwriting on the condolence book. It turned out that the person who broke the glass was the auctioneer's wife because she thought her husband had a lover. When she saw Judith with her own eyes, she went to her husband's store. However, when she went to Judith's house, no one answered, so she angrily threw a brick to warn Judith. After knowing that it was a misunderstanding, she provided an important clue. It turned out that her husband resented Stefan because her husband's father had a famous painting, but before he died, he did not leave it to her husband but gave it to his old business partner, Stefan. Although her husband had certain problems, she believed that he would absolutely not commit such a robbery. At this point, the investigation returned to the starting point. Unexpectedly, there was a noise at Stefan's house that night. Judith used binoculars to look and discovered a light in the house opposite. She immediately told the other 2 to call the police while she rowed a boat to the opposite shore. It turned out that the glass door had been broken. Judith hurriedly stepped in, and sure enough, she discovered a light from a flashlight in the darkness. However, she was knocked unconscious immediately after. When she woke up, her 2 teammates had arrived at the scene with Tonica. At this time, Bex suddenly discovered that there was dust left next to the painting on the wall. Bex said that there should have been a larger painting that had just been stolen. At this time, Judith suddenly thought that the stolen painting could be the famous painting that the auctioneer's father had given Stefan. After a night of thinking, Judith went to find Tonica again, but she was refused by the security guard. So when no one was on guard, she sneaked into the police office. At that time, an emergency meeting was taking place about solving the case. Based on the insurance fingerprints list and comparing each item, they were able to determine that the mixed painting was the famous painting. According to the auctioneer, he was home alone, but his wife was at the cinema, so there was no way to prove his absence. As for the antique collector, after being released, he immediately left town. After analyzing the footprints and fingerprints at the scene, they did not belong to the auctioneer. As for the necklace badge, after examining the victim, it was also not related to the Navy or warship. But if the two cases were the same murderer, why was the badge not found at first seen? At this moment, Judith suddenly spoke up that she knew the answer, but the police did not care, because they were the police, yet they let an ordinary person into the investigation room. This was also what Judith wanted to talk about. Tanika had no choice but to follow him to the first murder scene. It turned out that Judith had invited a neighbor who was good at using magnets to pick up things. Not long after, she pulled up a badge from the river and wrote the same word on it. It seemed that the two murders had become strangely similar. Moreover, based on the three noble virtues of Christianity, hope and love, it could be deduced that a third murder would soon appear. Judith also told the police about this discovery, saying that this would become a serial murder case. These three ordinary women were hired by Tanika as civilian consultants to investigate the murder. They quickly looked at the police's internal investigation report and immediately got excited and started working. Since they had found badges in the mouths of two victims, they speculated that there would be another woman murdered to match the charity badge, because trust in the Bible was also the motto of the association. So Judith suggested that the police quickly check the list of believers. As for the suspect, Tanika had also ruled out the suspicion of the antique gun collector, because at the time of the crime, this person was in America. Moreover, behind his house there was an old gate, but it was useless. Anyone could have sneaked in and taken the murder weapon. Now the difficult problem ahead was very strange, because the suspects they found all had alibis. However, that was not what Judith was most worried about. What if the killer was someone else, and there was no connection? It didn't take long for the bad news to come, because there were no suspects on the list and no names of the victims. But the good news was that the three of them had found a new target: the sneaky red-haired woman that Bex met at the victim's funeral. She was a classmate of Bex's yoga class, and Susie also thought that this name sounded like a killer, so she immediately contacted Tanika. She knew the red-haired woman and her husband ran the boating center because she had walked her dog a few years ago. A big flood had damaged the business so badly that they had to sell their property. The whole town had come together to help them through the hard times. The three of them had gone to the boating center. However, the conversation that followed was a complete surprise to them, because the red-haired woman denied all their questions. First of all, she had never known Stefan, the victim of the first murder. She had only shown up at the funeral because she happened to be resting on the bench. She had never even heard the name of the second murdered driver. After the red-haired woman finished speaking, she made an excuse that she was busy and left with an innocent look. The three people were extremely skeptical about this answer. In order to compare the fingerprints found at the victim's house, Judith first took advantage of the dog poop bag that the dog walker usually carried to steal the notebook with the fingerprints of the red-haired woman next to it. They soon found her husband, but the conversation that followed was even more confusing. Her husband was Danny. He sincerely told them that his wife had known the first victim through art many years ago. Although the two were not very close, his wife was still very sad about Stefan's passing. As for the second victim, they had met before, because one day the family car broke down. His wife took the victim's taxi to do her weekly shopping. Obviously, the answers of the two husband and wife were contradictory, so who was telling the truth? Fortunately, the dog walker had a lot of house keys, so the three of them immediately went to the second victim's house. Susie had indeed checked call log on the landline through the phone number Bex had provided. Sure enough, the red-haired woman had called a taxi last week. At this time, Judith discovered a suspicious lawyer's letter. It turned out that the driver had an inheritance from a neighbor. Susie immediately remembered that the neighbor was the dog's previous owner. It turned out that after the neighbor passed away, he not only gave the dog to the driver, but also left all his assets under his name to the driver. This must have been the reason why the driver was so happy. But 2 weeks after the neighbor died, a lawyer named Jean drafted a new will, and this time the only beneficiary was the lawyer. That's why the driver felt like he was cheated. So Judith decided to investigate lawyer John. They went back to the police station and asked the police to verify whether the remaining fingerprints matched those of the red-haired woman. Immediately after that, Judith took the initiative again and asked Tanika to order her subordinates to cooperate completely and follow unconditionally. Next, they turned to the new target, lawyer Jean. Bex was responsible for surveillance at the restaurant. Susie was in charge of monitoring and contacting along the way. Time was also calculated down to the second. Suddenly, Judith appeared in front of lawyer Jean. She used the excuse of needing advice on her inheritance of a villa from her aunt to cleverly lead to lawyer Jean's criminal act of changing the will. Unexpectedly, her few words immediately made him extremely worried. Immediately after, she was surprised to find that the lawyer had destroyed a piece of paper as soon as he returned to the office. There must be a secret hidden in the paper. Lawyer Jean must be related to the murder of the driver. So the three of them immediately searched for architectural drawings to make a detailed plan to steal the documents from the shredder. Immediately after, three beautiful girls in disguise appeared in front of the lawyer's office, and the action plan was immediately deployed. Susie and Judith waited for the signal in the small garden. Meanwhile, Bex went to the secretary's desk to make an appointment and then used the excuse of going to the toilet to turn around and sneak into the tea room on the second floor. She took advantage of the moment when no one was paying attention to quickly put the prepared bread slices into the toaster and aimed it at the smoke detector above, then covered the slices with a paper towel. After everything was ready, Bex calmly returned and waited. At this time, Susie and Judith, who were outside, also arrived under the window of the law office. The alarm soon rang, and the lawyer immediately directed all the clients to go outside. Just as they had expected, Susie took this opportunity to use the dog leash to climb in. Although the process was a bit difficult, she finally succeeded in exchanging the scraps of paper. At this time, the smoking toaster was discovered by the secretary. The lawyer saw that it was just a false alarm, so he immediately ordered everyone to go back to work. However, Susie had already taken the items, but before she could jump out the window to escape, the lawyer returned to the office. Just when Susie was about to be exposed, Bex luckily used her plan to buy time for Susie to escape under the table. Just like that, the three people's theft plan was completed in a dramatic way. However, solving this complicated paper puzzle became a long-term problem, and at this time, Judith received a call from Tanika to confirm safety. It turned out that the police had used GPS to track the driver's location route. They discovered that the car had arrived at the gun collector's house. Then the gun thief pointed directly at the suspect, the red-haired woman. Coincidentally, when analyzed, the fingerprints also matched the fingerprints left on the victim's door and window. Therefore, Tanika immediately ordered the arrest. Hearing this news, the three women could not miss the rare opportunity to catch the murderer. So as soon as the police car arrived at the rowing center, they followed to the scene. However, they did not expect that the red-haired woman would become the third victim of the shooting. Later, they discovered Charity's badge in the mouth of the body. Obviously, she was also a victim in this serial murder case. After that, the police still collected evidence here, but Judith rode her bicycle away alone. She immediately rushed into the auction house to question the owner about where he was an hour ago, but his wife explained that the company was holding a watch auction, so the attendees could provide an alibi. At this time, Judith always felt that something was wrong, because there seemed to be a few photos missing from the office wall. However, he immediately realized something was wrong, so he used the idea of calling the police to threaten and chase her away. Judith had no choice but to turn around and leave. However, he secretly made a phone call. As soon as Judith got home, she immediately adjusted the clues on the wall. Then, at exactly 6 o'clock, she dived into the Thames to swim. At this time, a group of rowers practicing passed by, which made her immediately remember that the photo was about rowing. However, the auctioneer hid these things for what reason, and how did this have anything to do with the paper that the lawyer had destroyed? Judith seemed to have thought of something, so the next day she gathered her friends to discuss it again. Because she had pieced together the scraps of paper using the patterns on the back, she discovered that this was an obituary. Two people had passed away. The time of death was last year, but their signatures as witnesses to the will were from a few weeks ago. This showed that the lawyer had forged the documents and was later discovered by the driver, so he killed the driver. However, there was an extremely coincidental coincidence that Tanika said that the lawyer was being treated in the hospital when the incident happened. So now Judith needed their help. After Judith finished speaking, she opened the collection room in her aunt's house. Unexpectedly, the whole room was filled with old newspapers. There was only a small corner for her personal belongings. Now Judith needed to verify her guess. She looked for who the auctioneer had rode with when he was in school. Obviously, the workload was huge, so they immediately started searching. But this process was obviously difficult. However, Susie could not contain her curiosity. Then she discovered a secret that no one knew about in Judith's belongings. It turned out that Judith was involved in the theft of Greek treasures many years ago. Perhaps this was why she was reluctant to talk about her past. From there, Judith uncovered memories that had been buried for a long time. It turned out that her husband had stolen the statue of the hunting goddess from an archaeological dig, but Judith foolishly lied to provide him with an alibi. As a result, her husband was cleared of charges. However, he later hid it from her and sold the statue for a large sum of money. Although she discovered discovered it in time and reported it to the police, her husband abandoned her. He then fled abroad alone, leaving her unable to escape the scandal until the end of her career. However, after Judith finished saying these things, she became angry and asked her two friends to leave immediately without knowing that she had found the newspaper. She then tore off the false clues on the wall. When Judith saw the interview with Stefan that year, she suddenly thought of a guess. On the day the victim was murdered, Judith was swimming and saw a blue canoe on the riverbank. However, the newspaper said that Stefan could not swim, which led to his complete unwillingness to participate in rowing. The clues were all related to rowing, as if pointing to who the real killer was. Judith immediately called the auctioneer's wife and made it clear that her husband was involved in 3 murders and had also stolen Stefan's famous painting. The wife also said that she always felt that there was something hidden in her house. However, at this time, her husband suddenly said that he wanted to go fishing and the car had already left. Hearing this, Judith immediately called the lawyer's office. Then she received information that the lawyer had gone on a business trip and would return tomorrow. At this point, Judith seemed to have guessed the outcome. She had a bad feeling that there would be a 4th murder. After thinking for a while, Judith finally called Bex and asked them to stay away from her house tonight. Even phone contact was not allowed. Actually, she had realized the danger when she found the newspaper, so she pretended to be angry so that her friends could leave quickly. Unexpectedly, at this moment, the man in black arrived by boat. He first cut the phone line and then sneaked into Judith's house. At the same time, Susie received a call from Bex, but she was on her way to the airport to pick up her daughter. Hearing that Judith might be in danger, Susie immediately turned around. At this time, the police received an alarm call that someone had seen a suspicious person running away on the bridge with a gun. But at this time, Bex ran over and said that Judith was in danger. Tanika immediately understood that the news was definitely a trick of the murderer, so she quickly led the team to Judith's house. However, the police car had not gone far when they were blocked by a large tree blown down by the wind. Seeing this, Beck immediately got out of the car and rushed into the nearby church. She decisively cut the bell rope and ordered the pastor to quickly bring the eulogy to Tanika. She borrowed the parish council president's truck. Meanwhile, because the Marlow bridge was blocked, Susie could only park her car on the riverbank opposite Judith's house. However, the bridge required a 2-kilometer detour to reach, so she had to walk. Both sides were carrying out intense rescue operations, but Judith was very calm here. She faced the man in black holding the antique gun and called the opponent's name Danny. At this time, Danny did not pretend anymore. Danny was sure of winning, so he let Judith talk freely. It turned out that Danny had wanted to sell the rowing center for a large sum of money, but his wife refused. So he used his wife's phone to book a driver's car and went to the antique collector's place to steal the antique gun. Although his wife was not murdered by him, he murdered Stefan, whom he did not know. The boat at the scene belonged to Danny, so after committing the crime, he suddenly disappeared. He had no motive for the crime, so the police could not trace him at all. In fact, Danny had taken action on behalf of the auctioneer, but he had taken action on the driver, killing 2 birds with 1 stone. Then today, the lawyer came to the rowing center and used the same gun to kill Danny's wife. In this way, the 3 of them had completed the deadly triangle and each had a perfect alibi. When the first victim, Stefan, was murdered, the auctioneer involved was practicing in the choir. When the second victim, the driver, was murdered, the lawyer who had embezzled the inheritance was undergoing surgery in the hospital. When the red-haired woman, the third victim, was murdered, Danny was working as a rowing coach hundreds of kilometers away. It was an undeniable fact that although these 3 people had not seen each other for decades, they had all attended the same school and were all excellent rowers. Only the lawyer looked smaller, but he was the most important helmsman in the entire rowing team. They even won a competition in Marlow. 35 years later, the 3 of them met again by chance at a celebration. Then they learned that lawyer John was in trouble because the driver had also graduated from the same school and had a copy of the school magazine. He discovered his friend's secret. He angrily went to lawyer Jean and asked to restore the altered will. Otherwise, he would call the police and put lawyer Jean in jail. Then the other 2 also told him about their troubles, and the 3 of them quickly got along. The badge and the gun were the auctioneer's idea. This would make the police think that they were the same person. Unfortunately, all of this was exposed by Judith with her sharp eyes, but it seemed too late now. Danny had no intention of letting Judith go. At the crucial moment, Judith took the bottle of powder from her hand and threw it at Danny. Immediately after, she used a pencil to stab him when he was caught off guard. However, just as she was about to pick up the gun he quickly used his strength to subdue her. Unexpectedly, at the critical moment, Susie arrived in time. A wolf jumped in through the window and bit Danny's left hand that was holding the gun. At the same time, the police who came to rescue also entered the house. Just like that, the truth about the last 3 murders was finally revealed. Not long long after police stopped the auctioneer who was on his way to fishing, they found the famous stolen painting in his house. At the same time, the fugitive lawyer was also arrested. The crime-solving club was officially launched. Part 1 of the movie is here. Thank you everyone for watching. Goodbye, and see you again in the latest videos.